Okay, so we reached the point of the process where we're ready to start installing our kitchen cabinets. And as a general rule of thumb, it's always advisable to start with your upper cabinets. That way you can get directly under them and support them rather than having to lean over the base cabinets, which would be very awkward. It's a little unsafe, certainly off balance. It can be difficult to do that. So since I'm doing this by myself, there's one little trick I'm using, which is to install a little ledger board here. So this is just a piece of plywood or MDF, and I've had it screwed into the studs here. So we're going to simulate this wall. We're going to pretend this wall is your kitchen wall where you're going to install cabinets, or a home office if this is your office wall or whatever. So normally this wall would be covered by a 1/2 inch thick piece of drywall, paneling, something of that nature. But in this case, I haven't finished my basement yet, and rather than finish my basement for this project, I'm going to just show you how to do it here. Since I'm doing this installation by myself, I'm using this board to rest the cabinet on. Now, if you were doing this with a couple people or you had one other helper, you may not need this. But even in that case, I would still advise you to use one of these. It makes it a lot easier. So what I've done is the top of this board, where the cabinet bottom will rest on, is 54 inches from the floor. So that assumes a 34.5 inch cabinet height for the base cabinet. You add an inch or inch and a half for the countertop thickness, and then it's 18 inches up. So it's 34.5 plus an inch and a half is 36. 36 plus 18 is 54. So it's 54 inches right to here, and I think that's the general rule of thumb for cabinet height. So I'm going to start with, I'll probably do my two cherry cabinets first, since they're, just why not, right? When we install this cabinet, I'm going to lift this up just so you can see it. We're going to be driving our screws through this thick part of the cabinet back. Alright, so we put these stretcher boards on the back to give us some structural meat. So when we drive our fasteners through the cabinet into the studs, we want to make sure that those screws are going through these stretcher plates in the back. If they went through the 1/4 inch material, and only the 1/4 inch material, that is the primary decorative back of these cabinets, it's really not strong enough structurally to hold the weight. It might be, but you're certainly better off putting the bulk of your weight onto these stretcher plates. The other thing that will happen with your 1/4 inch material, especially in a section where, for this cabinet for instance, we have, it's about 3/4 of an inch recessed from the inside here. So if I were to drill a fastener or a screw through the 1/4 inch back plate, it'll actually bow the back of the material out, which you definitely don't want. So let's just assume this wall is drywalled. We have a ledger board here, whether that's a 2x4 or a ripped piece of plywood. 2x4 is nice because it's a fatter 1.5 inch edge. But you know what? 2x4s also tend to have a lot of movement on them. The only 2x4s I have here are pretty warped. So I'm just going to go with this. So this is fine. So again, we'll assume that this is a drywalled wall and that we've identified our stud locations. So what we could do is just take a stud finder and then mark the locations of the stud, and you want to put your marks sort of where they will be behind the cabinet. And to make it easier on you to find these cabinets, so find these studs, once you put your cabinet up and you're covering that mark and you're trying to identify where those studs are at, that's kind of a pain in the ass. So what we could do to make that easier would be to mark your stud location and then put a piece of painter's tape below it, or maybe even mark your ledger board where you think the studs are. And that way when we're hanging this up and drilling our screws in, we're not struggling to find these studs. In this case, it's going to be very easy since I have this stud wall. The stud's pretty much exposed. So what I'm going to do is, again, I have my doors installed. I'll probably take my shelves out just to make the cabinet as light as possible. I've got my screws ready to go. So the fasteners I'm going to be using for this installation, I'm just using 2.5, 3-inch long drywall screws. You can use wood screws if you like. I think these are plenty strong for our application. They've also got a little finish washer around the drywall screw. So you buy these separately. They come in little small packs, and you want to make sure the finish washer is sized appropriately for the screw you're using. So what these little finish washers do, aside from sort of looking decorative, which they're this is like a brushed nickel or stainless look, it allows the fastener or the screw head to sort of spread out that force on the cabinet, and it will prevent the screw from being overdriven through the wood. So what you don't want is your screw to go too far into your backer strip that it loses material to grab on. It would almost be like putting a thin nail through the back. You could just slide it off. So that finish washer is essential to help prevent that. I've also got a level ready to go, and my screw gun here. So what I'll do is just awkwardly pick this up. Not too heavy, but alright. And if this were a drywall wall, it would probably, so I'll have a bit of this going on back and forth in the right and left because there's no drywall there. But what I can do is try to square the edges up here in the back. Okay, so you can see it's resting on this ledger board. I have one arm on it, and this isn't really going anywhere, thankfully. We'll install all hardware later, so I can just open this, and now I can put my hand here to hold it. So I have a backer board in this area here. Alright, so what I can do is put my screws in the cabinet. Okay, maintain that pressure there. And now, of course, this is the tricky part. It might be better to pre-drill. You're going to pretty much line this up. Alright. Alright, well that stunk. That was a giant pain in the butt. But the cabinet's up and it looks pretty good. It's nice and stable. Again, if I rock it this way, it'll move simply because there's no drywall there and it can pivot on the board. But a couple takeaways were definitely pre-drill your holes if you can. Use the finish washers. I kept banging my hand against the face frame down here when I held the drill sort of at a flat approach. And because the wrench would torque down and I'd bang my knuckles on it. There's actually some skin on this cabinet. Phenomenal. So what I'd recommend is if you get in these zones down here to rotate the drill up and come at it like this. That'll save your hands. And if in the top one I was able to go at it at a regular comfortable angle. So if we are installing an entire wall full of cabinets, the process sort of works like this. You're going to usually start in the corner if you have corner cabinets and work out. So start in your corner and go from the corner to the rest of the wall, and then from the other side of the corner go out again. When you install one of the upper cabinets, you don't necessarily have to drive it all the way into the wall. You can, but if you're doing multiple cabinets, what you want to do is then get your next cabinet up, net position it, and get the screws into the frame or to your 2x4s so that the cabinet will stay on the wall. And then what you want to do is push it back as much as you can. Maybe get the screws driven in except for the last 1/4 inch or so. And then what you're going to do is you're going to open up your doors and you're going to clamp the face frames to each other. All right, and what that does, well, it'll keep your cabinets tight against each other, and then you could flush up your seam. All right, so you can still move the cabinets in and out a little bit, but you want to flush your outer edge seam to the next cabinet and clamp them together with a C-clamp right here where they meet. And you would ideally want to use a little piece of scrap or a shim board on either side of the clamp so you don't mar the cabinet face frame wood. Alright, so once these cabinets are, so now at this point they're pinned to the wall, both cabinets are pinned to the wall, and they're clamped to each other this way. So then what you would do is pre-drill a hole through the face frame into the next face frame next to it. And you want the drill bit to be just a little smaller diameter than the screw. But you want to clearly go through both. You don't want to come out the other side, but you want to go through it around the same length as the screw, maybe a little shorter, and then follow it up with a screw. You don't necessarily have to use a finish washer for that part. I think you can if you want, but you're really just pinning and locking these two cabinets to each other so those face frames don't slip past one another and then the cabinets stay together. So you would do that in two spots, low and top, low and high, and then you could finish driving home your screws. Of course, you always have to check to make sure that before you get your first cabinet up and install it completely, you want to take level measurements using a level on the sides and on the top. If you're using a ledger board, make sure the lever board was level, and we did that before I installed it. As I was installing this ledger board, I made sure it was level. So now when I put the cabinet on it, it should be level, and it was, but you just got to check. And then verify it's level left and right this way, and then you're good. So as long as you're pinning cabinet to cabinet and the first cabinet is level and square, you should be good to go as you do the rest of the cabinets. So I'm going to take another few minutes now, and I'm going to hang up my white cabinet, my frameless cabinet next to it. Now these cabinets, since this one has a face frame and the one next to it will not have a face frame, I'm not going to tie them together. I'm just going to get them up just to install them. And I don't need to show you that process because it's the same exact way we hang this one. We'll line it up to a stud, pre-drill it, and drive it home with a couple fasteners using some finish washers. And then I will show you what we do with the base cabinets, but it's generally the same approach. Okay, so now we are going to just briefly discuss how to install base cabinets. It's going to be very similar to how we install the upper cabinets in that we're going to locate our studs in the wall. I'm going to pre-drill some holes, and then I'm going to use some wood fasteners or drywall screws with finish washers on them to drive these cabinets home. Before I do that, I want to make sure the cabinet is level on the floor. I want to make sure that this little drop is pretty much exactly even on both sides here, and it probably needs to go up just a smidge on that side to bring this end up a hair. We also want to check level front to back on the case of the cabinet. That looks perfect. Okay, so what you may notice, first of all, to correct any left or right, up and down type motions, what we would do is slide a shim under the sides of the cabinet case, and you can basically just slide it under there, get it to where you want it, secure it to the wall both in the top and inside the cabinet into the studs, and then what you would do is use a box cutter to score the shim to bring it up, or to have a clean cut there. If you have any excessive shimming or anything like that, if your floor is really out of whack, I'd probably recommend you use the floor levelers like we did in the white cabinet, but if that's not an option and you went with the solid sides, then you can just wrap the base of the cabinets in a very small concealable molding to hide any excessive gapping. But if it's just a thin piece of shim material, it shouldn't be a big deal. And the other thing, when we were looking at the front to back, there is a good gap here. I can put my finger in on this, between this stud and the cabinet, and this stud in the cabinet's about 1/4 of an inch. So this gap, we could Well, first of all, the cabinet is level in this direction, so I don't need to adjust it. But when I secure my fasteners in, it's going to want to drive the cabinet and close that gap. So what I would do in this case, with this gap, you have a couple options. You can drive your screw in and stop it as soon as it starts to pull the cabinet up. You can just leave it there. The other, and probably the more preferred option, would be to stick some shims back there to jam and to take up that space, and then to pre-drill and drive your fastener home. And that will prevent the cabinet from kind of rocking in that space.